Welcome to This Explainer. Let's just jump right in with something you've probably heard argued about on the radio or online. Taylor Swift's album Red. When that dropped, it sparked this absolutely massive cultural conversation around her alleged brief relationship at age 20 with a 29-year-old actor. But if we step back from the celebrity gossip for a second, that whole conversation actually exposed a really fascinating universal mechanism that governs, well, almost everything in our world. And that is power asymmetry. So today, we're going on a bit of a journey to unpack the true nature of power and control. We're going to look at how these imbalances exist at literally every level of human interaction, from the super intimate relationships we form all the way up to the highest offices of government. And finally, we'll look at what actually happens when society pushes back. Okay, here is our roadmap for today. First up, the micro-relationship power. Second, the macro-presidential power. And third, the pushback, public protest. All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the micro-relationship power, unpacking the personal imbalance. So, power imbalances usually start right in our personal lives, right? And one of the most highly debated forms of this is the age gap in romantic relationships. Now, obviously, two consenting adults are completely free to date whoever they want, but the underlying psychological and social dynamics at play here are incredibly revealing when you look at them through the lens of power. Take this quote, for example. It gets right to the heart of a huge societal debate. Legally speaking, sure, you're an adult at 18. You can vote, you can work, you can get married. But neurologically, that's a different story. The human prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain that handles impulses, judgments, and complex emotions, actually doesn't fully develop until you're around 25. An 18-year-old is still literally forging their core identity. So when an older individual, who's totally established in their adult life, dates someone significantly younger, well, it just inherently introduces an imbalance in life experience and emotional self-assurance. And if you look at the data, it's wild just how prevalent this is. A massive global study showed that the worldwide average age gap is 4.2 years, with men being the older partner about 75% of the time. Now, interestingly enough, research actually indicates that the older partner is usually the one who's happier with the relationship dynamic. Meanwhile, younger women dating older men often report perceiving a much higher level of financial stability. So, what is the science actually telling us here? It's showing that age gaps almost automatically introduce financial and social imbalances into the partnership from day one.
Which brings us to the absolutely crucial concept for today, power asymmetry. And to be clear, this isn't just about age or gender, not at all. It's any imbalance resulting from differences in knowledge, life experience, financial security, physical strength, or even social status. In literally any relationship, the more powerful partner might intentionally or even unintentionally try to dominate, or the less powerful partner might manipulate the situation just to get their needs met. Recognizing that these asymmetries exist is honestly the very first step to navigating them. And this comparison brilliantly illustrates the two totally different paths this can take. On one side, you have what happens when power asymmetry goes really wrong. We're talking about the hallmarks of toxic manipulation born from deep power imbalances, controlling behavior, emotional blackmail, gaslighting, and isolating a partner from their friends and family. But contrast that with the other side, the equality wheel. This requires shared responsibility, a true economic partnership, and mutual input. It really shows us that a healthy relationship doesn't just happen by accident. It requires active, conscious work to equalize power regardless of whatever natural imbalances might exist. Okay, let's zoom out and move to Section 2, the macro, presidential power, scaling up to the state. So think about this. If a relationship between just two people can become imbalanced, what on earth happens when one person holds the highest office in a rapidly growing nation? We're going to jump back to the 19th and early 20th century U.S. presidents to see how executive authority really expanded. This timeline maps out a pretty incredible, steady expansion of presidential power over just a few decades. You've got Martin Van Buren pushing for an independent treasury to control national funds, James K. Polk's massive territorial expansion, Millard Fillmore's incredibly controversial domestic compromises, Rutherford B. Hayes actually using the military during peacetime, all the way up to William Howard Taft managing overseas protectorates. Step by step, the executive branch amassed a highly asymmetrical amount of power over the general public. Now, what's truly fascinating about this era is how public opinion was leveraged to project immense state power. Take President James K. Polk. He ran heavily on the expansionist ideology of Manifest Destiny. And to claim the Oregon Territory from the British, Polk's supporters rallied behind this super aggressive slogan, 54-40 or fight. Polk capitalized on this massive wave of public pressure, literally risking a naval confrontation with the British Empire just to secure a diplomatic victory and expand the nation's borders. Talk about permanently shifting the geopolitical power dynamic.
And as the nation expanded, so did the direct, asymmetrical power the president held over everyday civilians. Polk micromanaged the Mexican-American War, which ultimately added 1.2 million square miles to the U.S. Fillmore, in an attempt to preserve the Union, signed the Fugitive Slave Act, wielding immense federal power to override local state laws. And Hayes? He set a massive precedent by deploying federal troops against civilian workers during the 1877 Great Railway Strike. These are prime textbook examples of the state exercising ultimate top-down control.
And the ripple effects of this executive power were just staggering, both domestically and globally. Domestically, the Fugitive Slave Act essentially suspended habeas corpus for accused runaway slaves, completely denying them due process. Internationally, President Fillmore authorized Commodore Matthew Perry to literally sail a heavily armed naval squadron into Tokyo Bay in 1853, using the sheer threat of advanced firepower to force Japan to open up to Western trade. Years later, you see Taft utilizing his authority in the Philippines to completely overhaul the civil structure, even negotiating directly with the Vatican to buy 390,000 acres of church land. The scope of the power these men wielded is just hard to wrap their head around. Okay, actually, before things get too heavy, let's take a quick, fascinating detour. Amidst all this intense statecraft, President Millard Fillmore, who, by the way, was a guy who didn't even have access to a real library until he was 17, he established the very first permanent White House library. He loved books so much, he insisted on having a dedicated space for them. And years later, Abraham Lincoln would use that exact same library as a quiet refuge from the agonizing pressures of the Civil War. It's kind of nice, right? It's a great reminder that even the people wielding this massive macro-level power are still, at the end of the day, just humans seeking a little comfort. Which naturally brings us to a pivotal question. We've seen how power can become incredibly concentrated at the top. But as we know, power in society isn't a one-way street. So what happens when the citizens themselves look at this massive institutional power imbalance and decide, you know what, this has simply gone too far? How exactly does the less powerful group push back? And that brings us to Section 3, the pushback, public protest, the 1960s student movement. So we are fast-forwarding now to the 1960s, a time when an entire generation began actively challenging these macro power dynamics, particularly focusing their energy on opposing the Vietnam War. But here's the thing. The foundation of these huge college protests didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was built by radical academics. Thinkers like C. Wright Mills argued that a power elite of bureaucrats and corporate executives were secretly running the country. William A. Williams argued that the nation was fundamentally imperialist at its core. And Herbert Marcuse taught this concept that America's free speech was actually an oppressive tolerance designed to disguise a dictatorship. For the college students reading these texts, the government and corporate structures weren't just flawed, they were an undemocratic alliance that actively needed to be dismantled. And honestly, nothing highlighted this perceived injustice more clearly than the military draft. There was this massive, undeniable power and class imbalance at play. Just look at these numbers. 80% of the youth serving in the military came from blue-collar and working-class backgrounds, while college students from the middle and upper classes were routinely granted draft deferments. So you have millions of students clustered on campuses, terrified they might lose their deferment, making universities into these massive pressure cookers. Students felt mortally compelled to protest the corporate and military recruiters who were showing up right there on their campus quads. But it's important to note that the pushback was definitely not a monolith. It splintered wildly based on just how far different groups were willing to go to equalize power. You had the Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS, who started with peaceful campus protests and voter registration drives, like the 1964 Freedom Summer. Later on, a faction called Progressive Labor tried to bypass campuses entirely and recruit factory workers directly. But then you had the Weathermen. This was a radical offshoot that decided peaceful protest just wasn't cutting it anymore. They attempted to launch an actual guerrilla insurgency, utilizing violent bombings against government and corporate targets. It really shows how a desperate desire to correct a power imbalance can scale all the way from peaceful organizing up to violent extremism. Which leaves us right here. Today, we've traced the architecture of power from the intimate dynamic of a dating age gap up through the massive territorial expansion of 19th century presidents, all the way over to the explosive campus protests of the 1960s. And the common denominator through it all, power asymmetry. So my final question to you is this.
Now that you know what to look for and can see these dynamics at play, how do you navigate the power asymmetries in your own life and in your community? Thank you so much for watching this explainer. Keep questioning the balance of power, and I'll see you next time.